Welcome to Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters, stories, and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content. I'm Henry Bernstein.
And I'm Brandon Bernstein.
No relation. I'm a lifelong comic book reader and collector. I've been reading comics, mostly Superman and DC comics, since I was about 7 years old. I've been collecting seriously since I was 11. I would say my comic collector cred is that I have every single issue of Superman and Action Comics from 1986 until the present. I'm also a Jewish educator. I teach Judaic studies in a Chicago middle school. And in 2009, I wrote a curriculum as part of a master's program focusing on the Jewish aspects of superhero comic books. I've taught it in many iterations to many different age groups.
And once again, this is Brandon. I started reading comics when I was in the second grade. I haven't stopped since. I'm more of a Marvel guy myself, and my cred is probably a collection of Uncanny X-Men that goes from about issue number 150 to the modern day. So it was a pretty lengthy, many hundreds of issues. I'm also a rabbi working on a local college campus here in the Chicago area. And I've always maintained that these two passions, Judaism and comic books, actually have a great deal in common. They're both narrative-based mythologies on which each subsequent generation builds upon the ideas of the previous ones, while its most devoted acolytes obsess over the minutiae. I mean, is there really that big of a difference between continuity and halakha? But this podcast isn't about what Judaism and comic books have in common. It's about what happens when they overlap.
Yeah, I've always been bothered by why there isn't more explicit Jewish content in comics. You know, every few years you'll get one tiny reference, a character saying a Yiddish word or something. But from my perspective, the examples are far and few between. So when looking at this, Brandon, what is explicitly Jewish content?
Yeah, great question. I think for our purposes, explicitly Jewish content is any story that might contain quotes from Jewish texts or liturgy or history, characters that are openly embracing their heritage, maybe characters using Hebrew or praying in a synagogue or celebrating Jewish holidays or talking about why they don't like to do any of those things. Basically, we're looking for characters actually living a Jewish experience, not just stereotypically throwing out the word oy or chutzpah, although I think inevitably we're going to find examples of that, and we'll talk about that too.
So, Brandon, who are we going to talk about first?
Well, I'm really excited. I don't know what other character we could start with other than Benjamin J. Grimm, the ever-loving blue-eyed thing.
It's clobbering time.
The Thing first appeared at the dawn of the age of Marvel superheroes in Fantastic Four #1, which was published in November 1961 by Stan the Man Lee and Jack the King Kirby. Basically, in Fantastic Four #1, you have a scientist, his best friend, his fiancée, and his fiancée's younger sister, all rushing to beat the Russians, because this was the Cold War, in a space race to see who can head out into the cosmos. The team breaks into the space shuttle, launches themselves out into space, and get hit by cosmic rays. When they return to Earth, they find that those rays have transformed them completely, giving them incredible powers that they vow to use for the sake of mankind. Of course, one of them doesn't really get a gift in powers, but something that's more of a curse, and that's Benjamin J. Grimm, who ends up transforming into this weird orange rock monster.
It's all coming back to me now.
So, how do we know he's Jewish?
Great question, Henry. How do we know he's Jewish? It's actually something that doesn't really get clarified until later, and we're going to look at a handful of issues that really sort of explore things Jewish identity. So today we're really going to be talking in depth about Fantastic Four Volume 3, number 56, The Thing Volume 2, number 8, Fantastic Four Volume 6, number 5, and a handful of smaller stories from larger anthologies, those being the Marvel Holiday Special 1994, the Marvel Holiday Special 2004, and the Marvel Holiday Comic 2011.
So if the Fantastic Four first appeared in 1961, and we're looking at things from 1994 and on, how much time are we actually dealing with information that he's Jewish?
Well, we're actually going to start a little bit earlier than 1994 because there's some apocryphal evidence, but the most fascinating of these is actually in 1976, the Kirby family, that being the family of Jack the King Kirby, illustrator and creator of so many amazing Marvel comics. Jack Kirby sends out this holiday Hanukkah card from the Kirbys that pictures the Thing wearing a yarmulke, a talit, holding a prayer book, with a menorah behind him and wishing everyone a happy Hanukkah. In fact, it specifically says, remembering you at Hanukkah and hoping you will find that your holiday leaves many special memories behind. Happy Hanukkah, the Kirbys. I actually would love to talk about a couple details in the image that we're seeing. So, that prayer book in the Thing's hands. We have the Star of David on one side, so clearly letting you know this is a Jewish book. And on the other hand, there appears to be a couple letters. I don't know what you think. It looks to me like it's Yud Bet, which I thought maybe is a reference. Yud Bet would be 12. Hebrew numerology for 12. Exactly. Yeah. Like maybe it's a reference to the 12 tribes. Do you have any thoughts on what that is or what that could be on the Siddur?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm stumped.
Yeah. So speaking of stumped, this is the thing that confused me the most. Right above the Thing's tie and below his chin, there's a tiny Hebrew print that spells out the phrase Ichulim LaChanukkah. Now, if we were going to translate that, we would best probably translate it as like wishes for Hanukkah. But here's the thing. I've never heard this greeting for Hanukkah in my life. And I even did a little bit of research trying to see, is this an American Hanukkah holiday statement? Is this something that was popular in the 70s? I went and did research to friends of mine who are academics that sort of study American Judaism. Nobody had heard of this phrase. No one was sure what it was. All right, so I have no idea where this phrase comes from. And the last thing that I just want to, well, two last things I want to point out. I hate to be pedantic about it, but the most common error I ever see in depicting a Chanukiah on Hanukkah time is that people show a menorah as it's found in the temple, right, having only 7 branches, right, as opposed to the Chanukiah, which has 9 branches. Now, weirdly enough, this one seems to only have 5 branches. Yeah. I think it's just like an artistic thing that Jack could only draw that much and was doing it quickly. I don't think there was any intent behind it. It's just a little deal. So we've got this image. It's just really cool.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I'm looking at it now. I've looked at it 100 times. You and I have been talking about this for months. And even just now looking at it, I'm getting a little verklempt, just seeing, getting a little emotional, seeing a superhero that millions of people know and love. This is what we call explicit Jewish content. He's wearing a kippah, holding a prayer book, wearing a talis, observing a Jewish holiday, and it just, it gets me right there in the kishkas.
Completely, 100%. I feel it also. And there's really, I've seen a lot of images now of the Thing with a yarmulke and with a talis, to the point where I've seen enough. I don't know what it is, and I don't want to be just preferencing religious paraphernalia, but for some reason holding the Siddur just adds a whole other level of how much it impacts me and sort of makes me feel like, oh wow, I have something in common with this guy. This is a Jewish superhero who's not just happening to be Jewish, but has some involvement with this Jewish life in the way that I know it. I mean, again, I'm a rabbi. My Jewish experience is by no means the common one of most Jews here in the United States, but
right,
it really, there's some ineffable kinship I feel with him just seeing him in that way.
Maybe if you needed to make a minion, you could call up the Benjamin Grimm and he would come.
Right, and he wouldn't just come and be a body in the room, but he'd be like, yeah, I know what to do. And just grab grab the Siddur and be like, I don't like the prayers, but fine, I'll help you. Yeah, I love that idea.
The rabbi asks him if he wants to daven.
Yeah,
it's davening time.
That's all I want to hear. Yeah. That's all I want to hear.
After the holiday card, we really don't see much else until you mentioned 1994.
Right, and we'll get to that. That's really a sort of side issue. I don't want us to get lost into it yet, because really the canonical confirmation is going to come to us in 2002 in that Fantastic Four issue number 56 of Volume 3. Legacy numbering, it's number 485. Before we dive into the issue itself, I don't know, did you want to say anything about just sort of those apocryphal verbal stories leading up to it?
Yeah, there's, that people have said, I've heard in various places, that as Jack was drawing the thing, he wasn't just the artist. And of course, there's this long-standing debate in the comics world how much Jack really developed the characters, and it wasn't just Stan Lee. And of course, there was a horrible falling out, and that's a story for another time. But I heard this interview on the Imaginary Worlds podcast.
And it says, according to Kirby himself, the way the Thing talks and acts, you'll find that the Thing is really Jack Kirby. He has my manners, he has my manner of speech, and he thinks the way I do. He's excitable, very active among people, and he can muscle his way through a crowd. I'm that sort of person.
So, obviously, if you're writing a character that embodies your upbringing, your personality, and if you're Jewish, and you grew up in the Lower East Side of New York, poor, it must be that character that you're writing about is Jewish. It has to be.
Right, or at least is invested with that Jewishness, right? I found it interesting that in some ways Nick Fury was part of who Jack Kirby was.
Right.
But Nick Fury, the way he's talking at least, doesn't sound like Jack kept pouring his heart and soul into the character in a certain way, right? For whatever reason, the Thing became the focus. Because, otherwise by that argument, we could say that anybody Jack Kirby created, because they're all, in some ways, reflections, that the whole Marvel Universe is Jewish. And I don't think we're saying that.
Should we dive right into that book?
Let's dive in. So, Fantastic Four, Volume 3, number 56, written by Carl Kessel, drawn by Stuart Immonen, inked by Scott Koblish, colored by Liquid, lettered by Richard Starkings and Albert Deschenais, and edited by
Tom Brevoort. Cover was by Gabrielle Del Odo. And there's a special thanks to Greg and Jen Rucka, Steve Lieber, and Eve Kelsey. From my research, it looks like Steve Lieber is not related to Stan Lee or his brother Larry Lieber, who was the co-creator of Iron Man. Just a coincidence.
Great. So I just want to talk a little bit about the context surrounding this issue. Well, let's just get the cat out of the bag. This issue is famous for being the canonical issue that confirmed the Thing is Jewish. It's on the page. It's written out there. It's a big deal. If you Google Thing Jewish, I guarantee you will find dozens, if not hundreds, of blogs of all sorts of Jewish comic book writers saying, this issue talked about the Thing being Jewish. It's so amazing. This is the issue. So I just wanted to talk about a little bit of what's surrounding it. First of all, I just Carl Kessel, what a mensch. Oh. The most incredible mensch I've heard of. This man, not only is he coming in and filling in stories where he's needed, right? Because this is actually, this is sort of right before this famous Mark Waid, Mike Wieringo run that starts with issue number 60. It's this famous revered Fantastic Four run. It's in between that and this Carlos Pacheco run. So, Carlos Pacheco had been the artist on the book. He was both drawing and also plotting. And so the writer was really only coming in and doing scripts. So they started bringing in writers to really help Carlos Pacheco out with dialogue. And so Carl Kessel was one of those writers, and he's mostly coming in and helping out Carlos. Carlos leaves the book, and then Carl Kessel is writing solo for issues 55 and 56. Again, only a few issues before that famous Waid Wieringo run starts. So, for me, it's just he comes in, he fills the need, he gets out. What, incredible comic book work. But it doesn't stop there. So I found out in 2012, when he's 53 years old, Carl Kessel and his wife decide to adopt a baby. Okay, lots of people adopt babies, right? Not just any baby. He adopted a baby that was born addicted to heroin, right? This is a baby with incredible needs, right? And so, obviously, it's expensive to take care of this. So what does he do, Henry? He sold his entire comic book collection.
Oh, that breaks my heart.
Right? I know, but he sells it to pay the medical bills. The more I research this guy, the more I just realize that he's salt of the earth, incredible mensch. Like, what a stand-up
You want to
guy.
give him a hug.
I want to give him a hug,
Yeah.
and I'm so grateful that like a man of this caliber is the one who gifted us this story, right?
Yeah.
Like, how incredible.
Yeah, I want to say a couple things just as a personal note about
Yeah.
Carl Kiesel and Stuart Immonen, actually. Just, this is apropos of nothing other than that. He was inker and writer on Adventures of Superman for many years, and he and Tom Grummett, one of my all-time favorite Superman artists, co-created Superboy shortly after the death of Superman. So he was key to the Death of Superman storyline, one of the greatest storylines in comics.
Sure.
Created Superboy, the Superboy that's known as Connor Kent or Con-El, recently brought back into canon. And then Stuart Immonen took over drawing on Adventures of Superman from Tom Grummett. So just personally, I've been following those two creators for a long time. I own a lot of comics by those guys. So seeing them do something, and I always wish Superman was Jewish, of course. Like I'm always
Right, and like,
reading Superman with the lens of, oh, of course, the line from Superman 2, what a nice man, of course he's Jewish. Like,
right. And the comic book Judaism 101 that gets pointed out is like, Superman is the last baby. He's sent in an infant rocket ship to Earth. Isn't that Moses being sent down the river, right? Like, there's so much about Superman's origin that it's like, how could he not be Jewish? And yet, like, canonically, he's not Jewish.
And in fact, even at his wedding, he and Lois get married by a priest in a church, and the priest is drawn to look like Jerry Siegel.
Right.
And I love Dan Jurgens. He's my favorite of all time, but that one,
Right, it's a little sting. It's a little
Yeah,
sting,
yeah.
which is part of why, because so many of these comic books are written, for the most part, for sort of the majority in society, right? We're living in a Christian or secular society.
Right.
Most of these characters are written with sort of the default of like married in church, etc. And because that's so many of them, it's all the sweeter that we can get somebody like The Thing is like confirmed Jewish, like cling on to these instances. So we've got this issue. I think independently, Henry, we've both found research that talks about also Carl Kiesel, apparently. Apologies that I called him Kessel. So Carl Kiesel has had numerous interviews talking about this story because like it's probably going to be one of the most famous stories of his career. Like he's going to get remembered in so many ways as the writer who made The Thing Jewish, right? That's going to be probably, I don't know, I haven't read everything he's done. It's probably going to be one of the most significant contributions he made to comic books. So in these various interviews, it always inevitably comes up, no matter what he's working on. And so we've both separately done some research and found him describing that sort of scenario surrounding the issue. So Henry, you want to tell us a little bit about what went into the issue behind the scenes?
Yeah, so he was tasked with writing some fill-in issues, as you mentioned, and he says on the Word Balloon podcast, he confirms he was the one that made Ben officially Jewish.
Oh yeah, I was. Yeah, and I mean that was based on an old Kirby drawing. Jack had drawn Ben with a little prayer shawl and yarmulke. I'm not sure why he drew it. I think I remember it was on some card he sent out or something. And Tom Brevoort and I were just talking. This was one of those. I did, I think, 3 fill-in issues in a row, and Tom wanted important stories. And I said, Jack drew Ben as Jewish. Why don't we do that story?
That's great.
And I'm convinced, just personally that at the beginning, Ben was just, a character, but I'm convinced the longer Jack worked on him, the more of himself he put into Ben Grimm.
Sure.
So I know Stan Lee has said that they never, intended the character to be Jewish at the start, but I think by the end, he was, clearly, a stand-in for Jack himself in so many ways.
Should we go through the issues?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So we open up with a guy telling his friend that he's lost after a day wandering New York City. And he makes a comment, this part of town, some things ain't so nice. They're downtown, and specifically, this is the Lower East Side, which immediately is sort of evocative of this Jewish experience.
Specifically, they're at the corner of Yancey Street and an unnamed street, and this is on the title page with the credits.
Right.
Yancey, I think, is classically where Ben Grimm is supposedly from.
Right, he grows up on Yancey Street. There's this whole group of hoodlums called the Yancey Street Gang. In the modern comics, they're constantly giving Ben a hard time. They're constantly making fun of him and throwing fruit at him and things like that. And there's this implication that he grew up running with the tough boys of the Yancey Street Gang.
And it seems like Yancey Street is a stand-in for Delancey Street.
Definitely, yeah. If you know your New York City geography, you know it's probably Delancey Street. All right, so this guy's wandering through New York. He runs into Ben Grimm, who's, Ben's the one who told him, this part of town, some things ain't so nice. And we basically have Ben slowly making his way through Yancey Street. And I noticed, right, like basically the top of each page is Ben slowly walking through this decrepit, broken down part of the city. And in the middle of the pages, we have these flashback issues as Ben remembers his childhood growing up here. Now, I noticed that those borders, like I said, they're really dark. And the flashback issues, they're so light and so bright and vivid. And I was wondering if it was some sort of commentary on sort of the way memory gives us these halcyon days, this like better remembered compared with crummy modernity. Everything's so run down now. But back then, things were so great. And it made me think already, like knowing where the story goes, it made me think of sort of those, proud stories of the Jewish experience on the Lower East Side, that things were tough, but we remember how wonderful things were, right? Like there's this American Jewish experience where even though a lot of us who are American Jews didn't have this experience, the sort of like mother story of what it is to be a Jew who immigrates to America is you come in through Ellis Island, you come in through New York, and you wind up on the Lower East Side of New York.
It's romanticized.
Right, it's romanticized in this way, right? And we don't all have that story, but that has somehow become the romanticized Jewish story, and Ben's like falling fully within it right now.
It's interesting what you said about the lighting and everything. The flashbacks, there's definitely like sort of a brownish tone to it, almost sepia, and to try to like, I guess, make it seem sort of old,
right?
But it's not that it's not necessarily in contrast to a lighter modern time. And in modern times, it looks run down all the way through, basically.
Well, I actually thought there was a flip midway through. Like the first 6 pages, the flashbacks really did seem brighter to me. And that also corresponds with some of Ben's happier memories. After his brother dies, which, spoiler alert, Ben's brother dies, after that happens, right, that's when I noticed things started to get a little darker. Maybe I'm reading into it too much, but like that's how it seemed to me. All right,
so tell us about this first flashback.
Great, so basically, we have this guy named Mr. Scheckerberg keeping Ben in line. He's sort of dragging Ben along and threatening to take him to Mom because of something he did at the store, right? So we get Mr. Scheckerberg, super Jewish-sounding name. Not actually a Jewish name, but like that Berg ending clearly has it. There's something about the Scheck. Like, it clearly, Mr. Jewish stereotype, essentially, is the name, but like, it comes across. There's something about Mr. Scheckerberg. He owns a pawn shop, right? And so there's definitely like, there was a moment where I was a little concerned of like, oh, are we hovering in the territory of some like anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews and money? But like, to his credit, Mr. Scheckerberg seems more concerned with morality than with money.
Right. And who does he look like to you?
Oh, he 100% looks like Jack Kirby.
Yeah, we did. We have an image of a side by side of the two of them, and they look exactly alike.
Yeah, so. fully parallel. It's incredible. Right, so basically, like, Jack Kirby himself has been reintroduced as this, like...
the moral compass.
Cantankerous Jewish old man who's a moral compass, right? Like, the Thing doesn't get Jiminy Cricket, he gets Mr. Scheckerberg. Ben's older brother, Danny, sort of offers to pay off Mr. Scheckerberg to not go and tell Mom and not bother them. And basically, Ben has to agree to... help out Mr. Scheckerberg with his store.
Because Ben threw a stone through his window.
Right, Ben threw a stone through his window. But Danny starts telling Ben how Ben needs to fight for what is his. Ben needs to make a stand because Yancey Street is their street and they need to be able to take what they want. And Ben's sort of more of a dreamer. He points out the stars. And obviously this is an allusion to the idea that like one day the Fantastic Four are going to go into space. Yeah. I also wondered if maybe there's anything to like, when I hear stars in a Jewish context, I just think of Abraham and the covenant with God and God saying, I'm going to make your offspring as plentiful as the stars. Right. So there might be some Jewish weight to it. I don't know, but it's like a nice fun echo that's going on. So we get to page 6 and there's basically an officer talking to Ben Grimm and Ben's mother, and the officer is alluding to the fact that his brother Danny just died. And it's very clear that Ben Grimm has lost his faith, right? And there's actually some quote that I wanted to read. The officer says, I'm sure Danny was a good kid, and I'm sure God took him to a better place. And Ben's response is, but God left us here, didn't he? Heartbreaking, right? Like utterly heartbreaking and so real in terms of the platitudes people give you at those moments of death, like that sort of thing. And I just, reading the story, I couldn't help but see that for Ben, for the Thing, this is the moment where he loses his faith. And I think he has a break with his Judaism, right? And based on everything else that we see and what's going to be coming in terms of Ben essentially rediscovering Judaism in his adult life, I really do think this was probably the moment where he turned his back on it, and even if he'd been going to synagogue, stopped caring.
Do you think that that is an intentional, let's call it a retcon by Kiesel, to say that the reason why you haven't seen any mention of Ben's Judaism until now is because this event that happened to him, which we all knew about, Danny's death is something that's a part of Ben's origin, really. We've heard about it before, right?
You know what? The truth is, like, Fantastic Four is not my top priorities or like my top property, so I don't actually know, but like I would imagine it feels familiar, yeah.
Anyway, so it's like a way of saying the reason why you haven't heard about him being Jewish until right now is because when he was a kid, he said goodbye to Judaism.
Right. I 100% think that was intentional. And like, it at minimum, it's convenient, but I really do think that this was well thought out, that like, why else would he be so separated from this stuff? Why else, right? And like, even if it's not intended, looking at all the other stories, it cleans up so much of the confusion when there's some earlier issues where it's like, it really feels like Ben's not Jewish. Like, it totally covers it up just the way you were saying.
Right.
So
fast forward.
Fast forward, Ben is now trying out for that very same Yancey Street gang that he was trying to avoid before and he avoids in the future. Mr. Scheckerberg's yelling at him, "You're no better than your brother. May he rest in peace." Which, that was a line that I was like, how Jewish is that? The concept of like, you're no good brother. May his soul rest in peace. Right?
Yeah, chastising someone, but making sure you like show the proper amount of respect because he died.
Because completely, right? Like, it just like so felt to me as like the way that someone would be sort of taught to raise with those Yiddish inflections. Right. He has to make sure to get that out even as he's cantankerously yelling.
I love that too.
So we get this big reveal of what is it, Henry, that Ben actually stole from Mr. Scheckerberg?
He stole a Magen David, a Star of David, on a chain.
Right. And the other Yancey Street gang members make sure to mention that this is the one thing not for sale in that pawn shop where everything's for sale, which is a rude comment, but also I think like there's an implication that this Star of David, which clearly is representative of his Jewish identity, right? That his identity and his pride in his identity cannot be bought. All these other things can be bought. This guy that you might think is only about money, he actually has this pride, and there are some things that are beyond money. And I love the fact that it's like, yes, his pride and his Jewish heritage cannot be bought. That's like a strong Jewish model to me.
Absolutely. And I actually have a question about this part. You know, maybe, so you might not be able to answer it because, you know, Fantastic Four aren't they're not like your X-Men. But, you know, the Yancey, he's running away from the Yancey Street gang, and they're, you know, throwing stuff at him, and they seem to, the Yancey Street gang always seem to be just word bubbles.
Yeah.
Like, you don't see them.
Yeah, you never see them. They're always hiding in buildings and throwing things. Yeah, I think it's like an ongoing gag.
Oh, okay. So
right?
I've always thought of them as like, when he talks about them, when I've read Fantastic Four comics in the past, it seems like they're like a lovable group of rascals. But here they're like, they're pretty dangerous. Like, Danny loses his life, and they're encouraging Ben to steal. I didn't realize Like when I thought like Yancey Street Gang, like they're just like the old gang, like the way you talk about friends of yours. I didn't realize they were like troublemakers in the neighborhood. And so I'm wondering, are the rest of them Jewish?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, maybe, right? Like it could be this entire gang of Jewish hoodlums that were around.
Right. And there are stories in that same Imagining Worlds podcast. There are stories of Jack growing up very much in that way, having to fight, to protect himself,
completely,
and stuff like that. And that's part of the Jewish experience too. My grandfather would tell stories about, being called a dirty Jew and a Christ killer and getting beaten up every day. And then years later, when he was a salesman, those same people who would beat him up were his customers. That whole thing.
Well, I think the trick is that the Yancey Street Gang, right? Like the one we see in Ben's childhood, I could buy that they're all Jewish because they're on the Lower East Side. But once we flash forward to the future, the gang is still there. I don't think it's all those people as kids now Ben's age. I think it's still a bunch of kids. Like I imagine it's constantly this replenishing society, like any gang, right? That sort of brings in new members. So I think it's there.
And that's why they're always like teasing.
Yeah,
because they're kids.
Right, I think they're kids. Okay. I think they're just like punk kids that are there,
okay.
right? So like, yes, they had to fight, and maybe they were Jewish back then, but by page 8, we're getting to sort of the modern day. The pawn shop is still there, but everything around it is like either shut down or a porno theater or something like that. And I was realizing that the implication seems to be, as happens in actual history, the rest of the Jews moved uptown. Yeah. They left the East Side. They moved to sort of
the West Side,
the Upper West Side, or they move up, and they sort of move up economically, and they're doing better, and they leave behind them those days of having to fight and be street tough, and they start moving on to sort of the American economic success story. Right. And I was actually wondering as I was reading this, like, Henry, I think this probably hits a particular resonance for you, because while you didn't grow up in New York, you did grow up here in Chicago, and I know your family is particularly proud of, like, here in Chicago, similarly, the south side of Chicago used to be full of all of these Jews. They all moved to the north side, to the affluent white neighborhoods, and very few Jews stay behind in the south. But your family, I believe, did, yeah?
Right, correct, yeah. My brother, who currently lives in Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago, he's a fifth-generation South Sider, proudly. And, of course, I sold out and moved to the north side, but they'll never let me live that down. But for me growing up, a big part of my Jewish experience was hearing people say, wow, you came all the way from the South Side, when we go up to visit them in Skokie or other parts of Chicago that are Jewish. Or maybe one or two of my friends ever coming to my house as a kid, people saying things like, my friends' parents saying things like, well, is it safe? Which is exactly what you're talking about. Like, Jews have achieved a new socioeconomical status, so going back to that quote-unquote old neighborhood is, must be dangerous.
Right, it can't be something that we would want to do.
Right.
So it's fun, like, there's a way in which your family, like, your brother is the Mr. Scheckerberg holding down the fort and, totally like, remaining and still staying down there. All right, so... the Thing comes and visits the pawn shop, and Mr. Scheckerberg immediately attacks him, thinking that Ben is actually extorting him for protection money. It turns out, in a typical comic book coincidence, that someone has been sending threatening letters to Mr. Scheckerberg for a while now, saying if he doesn't pay some money, then they're going to come in and they're going to, mess up the store. They need to pay someone to keep them safe. And that very night is the night the money is due. So Mr. Scheckerberg assumes that Ben has to be the one. Now, of course, Thing is not actually the one who's doing that. It's a pure coincidence. But as this is happening, Mr. Scheckerberg actually reveals his full name, which is Hiram Scheckerberg, or Hiram Scheckerberg, which, of course, Hiram is coming from Hiram, the Hebrew name, meaning essentially highborn. It's actually a biblical name. It's referenced in both 2 Samuel 5:11 and 1 Kings 7:13-14 and a few other places. But in those two spots, they're mentioning this King Hiram of Tyre who helped Solomon with the building of the temple. And is as is so common in Jewish life, any name that is sort of used biblically is ripe for becoming a Jewish name throughout time. So,
not really a name that caught on, or like you would see those, like you might have some, like one of the Altacockers at your show might be named Hy, Hy, short for Hiram. didn't really stick.
No, it wasn't a very popular. In fact, the only other Hiram I really know of is I'm actually thinking also in comic books, in Archie comics, right? With Betty and Veronica.
Yeah.
Veronica's father's name is Hiram.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So, and that's a comic that must have been, I wouldn't know, but if we look it up, I would bet that Hiram Lodge probably dates back to the early days of Archie Comics. So I wonder if it's actually like a more common name from that point of time, like 30s and 40s, etc. And so maybe Carl Kiesel was just trying to pay homage to that point in time.
Yeah.
Who knows? We're back in the present day. Ben decides he's going to help out Mr. Scheckerberg, and so he goes to confront the Yancey Street gang, who he thinks, I can't believe that they're getting into extortion, basically, right? He can't believe it. Hijinks ensue. There's a really entertaining couple of pages where Ben goes to confront them, and this group of kids are just mopping the floor with Ben, throwing food at him, throwing trash at him, making him stink. It's just this like really entertaining couple of pages, and Ben returns to the shop humiliated, only to discover the true villain there, Powder Keg, the man with the explosive aura.
Now, had you ever heard of Powder Keg
Never.
before?
Never.
He's like a D-list villain, if that.
If that, yeah, very much a minor villain.
Yeah.
In fact, I like, embarrassing confession, I thought that he was created for the issue. I didn't even realize he had a
I just
history.
assumed he was.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So we get this like weird guy who apparently can just explode. And then, of course, we get the beautiful comic book team up. Ben and the Yancey Street gang team up and completely take out Powder Keg. But in the ensuing conflict, Mr. Scheckerberg basically gets hit and knocked out. And that's what gets us to sort of the big moment where Ben thinks Mr. Scheckerberg might be dead. And he wants to give him CPR, but of course he can't because he's an orange rock monster. He can't
he's enormous.
Right. He can't do resuscitation.
So you kind of get this zoom out. You're looking in the last panel on that page. We're zoomed out and we're looking above. It's almost as if we're from the perspective of the street lamp.
Ooh, cool.
That same street lamp in the splash page at the beginning, that thing was standing under.
Right.
Now, because we've got a little bit of light around Mr. Scheckerberg, he's lying there, and the thing says, let's see, been a while. And then he says,
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kuvod Malchuto, Le'olam Va'ed.
and they even put in a little like in between Shema and the second line, like he's really trying to remember it.
Right.
And he does.
He gets it, right? And it like brings to mind all these stories, like the Shema prayer, right? It's taught to Jewish kids, and it tends to be one of the, like, if they only know one thing, the Shema tends to be it. There are all these stories that you hear about these kids who, like, in the Holocaust, right? Their parents, to keep them safe, sent them to Christian homes or to a church or something, and they're raised as Christian, and like years later, people are going through trying to see if there's any Jewish survivors in these areas, like after the war and after 1945, and like people will walk into areas and they'll just start saying the Shema, and all of a sudden there'll be kids that are able to finish it, and they realize, like, no, this kid's actually Jewish, and they were just like sent here to escape the Holocaust. Like, it's very clearly this like crucial prayer. But the other reason it's super important, of course, is that it's actually part of the prayer that you're supposed to say before you die, right? And I wanted to get into this a little bit because the Shema is part of the deathbed vidui, or what's called the deathbed confessional. Right after Ben recites Shema, Mr. Scheckerberg wakes up. He's totally fine, right?
fine.
And he basically tells Ben, like, oh, next thing you're going to have them all gathering to say Kaddish for me, which is like the memorial prayer. And he's really worried about that. And you get the sense that Mr. Scheckerberg is actually like, poo, like it's bad luck for you to be saying this, right? So I just wanted to bring up, I thought it was interesting. It's actually not at all tempting fate or jinxing. There's this Jewish law code called the Shulchan Aruch. And in a section called Yoreh Dea 338, it actually reads as follows. I'm going to read it in translation. If you feel death approaching, recite the vidui. Be reassured by those around you. Many have said the vidui and not died, and many have not said the vidui and still died. If you are unable to recite it aloud, say it in your heart, and if you are unable to recite it, others may recite it with you or for you. So I don't know if Karl Kiesel knew this when he was writing it, but like what Ben was doing was completely the Jewish thing to do in the moment. And Mr. Scheckerberg had no reason to worry that it was sort of like tempting fate, because like literally Jewish tradition says you should say it just in case, right? So I just thought that was like really interesting, that like I could see Mr. Scheckerberg being really worried about it. Why else would he be like, ugh, don't make them say Kaddish over me? But actually, like, it was the exact right thing to do.
That's beautiful. And of course, and just as a moment, I had a little note on here. Again, I've read this comic now 50 times since we started talking about it and discovered it. But this is unprecedented. This is one of the most Jewish moments in comics, if it might be the most.
Right, like outside of a few graphic novels that are very explicitly like my Jewish upbringing, or like I'm being
or
like
Mouse
or Mouse or something like that, right? Like outside of things that are like very clearly telling Jewish stories, right? I don't know if I've ever seen such a Jewish moment, right? Of
In
like
superhero comics.
in a superhero comic,
Yeah.
like it's unbelievable, and it's not the like cliche which we're going to get to, right? Of like a wedding or this like big ceremony, right? It's like this is just like a quieter Jewish moment.
Yeah, and it's like, a moment that is serious and that you wouldn't expect to see in, of course, superhero comics aren't serious. They're not always silly. But then, the thing is both comic relief and tragic. They play
Right.
that. That's like a big part of it. So to have this moment, just reading it again now even brought tears to my eyes, and there were tears of joy. I was imagining, if only I had read this comic when I was 11 years old. Like,
oh yeah, what must it have done for young Jews? I actually read a really interesting blog where someone wrote about how they hated the fact that Ben was Jewish in this way. And they didn't need to see it, they didn't want it, until like their young children were hearing about superheroes, and they were like, and Ben is Jewish, and the kid like freaked out and was like, he's like me, and the guy was like, oh, it's not for me.
Yeah.
It's for the kids,
kids.
right?
Yeah.
It's like if you were a young child reading comic books in 2002 and you're a young Jewish boy and you read this, I can't even imagine what that experience is like.
yeah, I almost wish I had, it's sort of the whole point of this podcast. Like, I wish this moment had existed when I was a kid reading comics.
Completely. Speaking of, though, that, like, tragedy comedy, as we said, it's kind of a comic beat when Mr. Scheckerberg wakes up, he's fine, and then we get this really beautiful heart-to-heart where Mr. Scheckerberg is impressed that Ben knew the Shema and could say anything.
And hasn't forgotten everything he learned in
right.
Temple.
Yeah, exactly, which is like that typical sort of like, I'm going to guilt you into things.
Yeah.
But he also is basically like, I thought you were maybe ashamed of being Jewish. You never say anything about it, right? And like for me, that like harkens back to Scheckerberg's sort of Magen David. Like if you're Jewish, you wear the symbols of it proudly. Seems to be his perspective, and he brings it up. And I thought Ben's response was also like,
great.
Gets you right in the heart, because he basically says, if people know, they could like find it out, but like I didn't want to emphasize it because, quote, figure there's enough trouble in this world without people thinking Jews are all monsters like me.
Yeah. He's basically saying to the camera, Jews in America, try to hide and try to fit in, but everyone you always know who's Jewish,
Right.
but so I never wanted to point it out, and it's sort of like, to me, it was sort of like I said, looking at the camera and saying, sorry about all that, I'm Jewish.
Right.
Like, it was like a moment of reckoning. Like, now I'm proud of it.
Right, I'm
I don't
proud.
have to, I don't have to hide it anymore.
Yeah, I didn't think about it that way before, but I like that reading a lot of sort of this meta moment of like, I don't need to hide it. What I was getting out of it was a lot of the thought of how often in my life, like, something happens and there's sort of the idea of like, this is either good or bad for the Jews. Like anytime someone Jewish is in the news for bad reasons, every Jew I know, right, is like, like what's going right? There's all this concern and worry.
You watch that Fire Festival documentary, you're like, thank God that guy wasn't Jewish.
Completely, right? Anytime there's something like where someone's getting cheated, right? Because Bernie Madoff, every Jew I knew was just like, oh my God, this looks so bad for us. This is awful. People are going to think we're all horrible, greedy, fraudulent people, right? And so here's the thing being like, I don't want everyone to think Jews are all these like monstrous type figures.
Which is also one of the tragedies of the thing. Like, he doesn't even realize he's a superhero.
Right.
The Fantastic Four in canon, in the Marvel Universe, are like the epitome of superheroes. Everyone loves them.
Not just superheroes, they're celebrities.
They're celebrities,
like,
right? They're not like the X-Men who are hated, or Spider-Man where it's like 50-50. Some people hate him, some people think he's a menace. Everyone loves the Fantastic
Everyone
Four.
absolutely adores them and goes crazy for them. They
Yeah.
want their autographs. They want to spend time with them.
Yeah.
Right? He's part of the most beloved group of all of superhero comics outside, right? In Marvel, definitely.
Marvel, yeah.
Maybe Superman's like more
Right.
beloved in DC, but like the most beloved team, and he can't get past the way that he looks. He can't get past this thing that makes him different, right? Which like also speaks to me of certain Jewish anxieties, right? That idea of like no matter how comfortable, the number of people I know where it's like no matter how comfortable they are in a place, there's always this concern of like we see Jewish history and like the other boot's going to fall and all this could crumble, right? Like Ben is caught up in that anxiety.
So they kind of have this tender moment. They even reference Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, I thought that was a
Yeah.
very writerly move and a weird one because like
Yeah.
Ben basically is like, I came back to return the star because I thought maybe today's the Day of Atonement, and like nobody calls it the Day of Atonement, right?
And also, he would know if it was Yom Kippur.
He would know if it's Yom Kippur for sure. And then like we get this really weird thing where Mr. Scheckerberg is like, I won't forgive you for 3 reasons, right? Like, 1, it's not the Day of Atonement. Scheckerberg would definitely say Yom Kippur. 2, right? You don't get forgiven on Yom Kippur. You get forgiven on the Jubilee year, the Yovel, which I've never heard this idea. I don't know where it's coming from.
Well, I think it's that all debts are forgiven.
Right, but like somehow they got mistaken as like all personal affronts.
Yeah,
that was super weird
yeah.
to me.
Also, what's more obscure than the Jewish Jubilee year, the Yovel year? in
Right,
the
like
Bible?
completely unknown. It's basically this idea that like after 7 sets of 7 years, so after 49 years or in the 50th year, all debts are forgiven, all land returns to its original owners. It's kind of this utopian vision that's
Yeah.
impossible to put out.
Right.
I mean, it's this utopian vision that's impossible to act upon and actually make happen. It's a beautiful concept, but so unknown.
So obscure.
And so weird.
Kudos
and, like,
to Carl Kiesel for putting that in
yeah,
there.
he really gave
Dig
an
deep.
effort,
Yeah.
right? But like, oof. And then finally, Mr. Scheckerberg is like, you don't have to apologize for anything. Like, I know that you lost your faith, essentially. Like, I know that you had such a difficult time, and like, why don't you keep that Star of David, more or less?
And then he compares him to
He
the Golem
compares him.
of Prague.
Right. The Golem of Prague, created by Rabbi Judah Loeb and Bezalel in the late 16th century, the most famous story of this golem, of this stone or clay warrior that sort of comes to life and protects the Jewish people and maybe gets a little too horrific, and it has the word truth written on its head, and if you erase one letter, it says death rather than truth, and so the golem dies. Mr. Scheckerberg points out the most famous story of the golem is one where it's kind of a monster, but it's like, it's not really a monster, it's a protector.
Right.
Ben, you're not really a monster.
Right, which is
You're
exactly
a
what it's
protector. Right. It's beautiful. And then Ben, of course, says like, all right, fine, but I'm not going back to synagogue, right? I'm gonna go, which like every joke I've heard constantly is the idea of like, yeah, people don't want to go back to synagogue, or like, you know, that
That's
joke
the
of-
shul I don't go to.
Right, that's the
Yeah.
show I don't go to. Or like, you know, the rule of, I think there's like a church that has this rat infestation, and they call him like exterminator after exterminator, and nobody's able to get rid of them. And the rabbi hears about it. The rabbi's like, "Oh, I can get rid of those mice for you, no problem." The rabbi goes in, and like all the mice disappear. There's no trace for them, right? And they're like, "What did you possibly do?" And the rabbi's like, I gave him a bar mitzvah. We never saw him again, right? And it's like that whole idea of like, yeah, like I'm never going back to synagogue. And then of course we get to like the final page and like the end joke of the issue, which you want to take us through that?
I'd love to. So he wraps up Powder Keg, and I think he basically ties the street lamp around him, and then Powder Keg says, "And you're really Jewish?" And Finn gets kind of defensive and says, "There a problem with that?" And Powder Keg, of course, says, "No, it's just you don't look Jewish."
But
Yeah, you can hear
you can totally get the rim shot. Yeah,
But I love that. That's great.
right. Like how else could this possibly have ended?
That's the sort of balance of the tragedy and the comedy with the thing.
Right. It's tragedy. It's comedy. But I think that also a very Jewish thing is like it ends with the comedy.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
We might start with the tragedy, but it ends with the comedy.
Right. Right. Exactly. I mean, so overall, I would give this, if I was rating this, we haven't really decided on a rating system, 4 out of 5 stars of David or something. But you know, there are only few explicitly Jewish moments, but the ones that they have are so rich and heavy and meaningful. You know, and I just again can't overstate how much seeing the Shema in a comic book means to me.
Yeah.
Like it really gets me in that spot.
It's hard to also divorce the impact of this issue from the story itself, right? Like, again, this was a huge news story. It was a big deal. All of a sudden, people could point to this issue and be like, no, did you know the thing is Jewish? And, like, there's this canonical proof. So this confirmation of his religion, the way that it was used, like, I have a hard time. If I were to rate it, I feel like if we had a five Magen David scale, like, I'd probably even give it a 4 or 4.5, just because it had some stuff that I felt was like factually wrong. It didn't have the most Jewish content, but it was so meaningful. It like used its Judaism so effectively, and it was so impactful on the wider on the wider comic book world and on the Jewish world in a certain way, that like I just, you know, I would not give it a 5, which I would like. I'm reserving for something that I think would like really blow me away. But like it's at the top, I think.
Yeah. Let's look at the next issue, which was The Thing number 8, which was written by Dan Slott, artist Kieran Dwyer, published by Marvel Comics. This is from July 5th, 2006. So why don't you tell us about this issue?
Great, and just want to throw out, colored by Laura Villari and lettered by David Lanfear. This is the last issue of the Thing's second solo series, which basically ran, I think, from 2005 to 2006. Dan Slott is writing it. Here we are, it's the last issue of a series that unfortunately didn't sell too well. And we've got, you know, he's the first writer to really do anything with Karl Kiesel's revelation from 4 years earlier and sort of move the Thing's Jewish story forward a little bit, right? Eagle-eared listeners will pick up that the Marvel Holiday Special 2004 came out in between these two issues, but it's really minor with what that does. So we'll get to it. But all right, so
nothing happens in the first 10 pages.
Right. Yeah, nothing happens. Like, you know, we'll go through it really quick. Basically, the series opens up with a superhero poker tournament. The Great Lake Avengers, who are having this really funny bit about constantly renaming themselves, show up. This is like a group of like C or D list superheroes, but the most notable part of the Great Lake Avengers is they have Squirrel Girl, who has exploded in popularity since and become really big. But basically, Thing lets them stay because Squirrel Girl's cool. Like, they weren't invited to the tournament, but he lets them stay. I also had a brief moment of like, there's Thing practicing a little bit of Hachnasat Orchin, welcoming guests, like what it meant. She's like, I want to let people stay, no problem. It's not until page 14 of this comic that we learn why the superhero poker tournament's going on. Well, technically page 15, but anyway, we get a flashback, and Ben's with Mr. Scheckerberg again, and Mr. Scheckerberg introduces Ben to a new character, Rabbi Lowenthal.
Of course.
And of course, Rabbi Lowenthal wants to basically talk to Ben about whether he's interested in having a bar mitzvah. And of course, Ben responds with the most typical misunderstanding that there is, which is like, I thought you have to be 13 to have a bar mitzvah. As many rabbis will tell you, as many Jewish educators will tell you, you don't have a bar or bat mitzvah. You become a bar or bat mitzvah, right? Bar mitzvah literally means son of the commandment or son of commandment. Bat mitzvah means daughter of commandment. And it's in reference to this Jewish idea that when you're a young kid and you don't really know any better, you're not actually responsible for your actions when it comes to like a Jewish legal basis. You're not punishable for it. And there's actually this really weird sort of tradition that your parents are punished for yours. And the whole idea of like the bar bat mitzvah is that once you hit the age of 13 for boys, 12 for girls, sometimes 13 for girls also. Once you hit that age, you become responsible for your own Jewish actions, and you become obligated under the Jewish system to do these prayers, fulfill these commandments, etc. And so the first commandment that most people fulfill is reading from the Torah and having an aliyah. And of course, you have the ceremony built around it, which is the bar mitzvah ceremony. But the moment you turn 13, you are bar mitzvah, right? Like, it's just this thing. So I found it a little weird that there's this like misunderstanding. The fact that Ben has it is fine, but it's a little weird that like the rabbi goes on to share this misunderstanding.
The synagogue they're at. So
yeah, let's talk about that.
You and I did a little research. there's a beautiful shot of the synagogue, of the exterior of the synagogue that they're walking to. It looks like a synagogue you've seen if you've been in New York, and we did a Google image search, and it's a spitting image of the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which would place it a 15-minute walk from certain parts of Delancey Street or Yancey Street.
Right.
So Slott here is actually using. I mean, kudos to him for actually going and using a real synagogue as a model that would have been in the place that he grew up, would have been his hometown shul,
Right.
where he should have been bar mitzvah.
Or possibly kudos to Kieran Dwyer, because he's the guy drawing the
there you
thing,
go.
right?
Yeah.
So, like, who knows whose idea it was? Maybe Dan sent pictures and was like, here's a reference of it.
Right.
Or maybe, Kieran did his own research. I don't know.
Yeah.
Funny thing about the Eldridge Street Synagogue, I went there only twice. Once when I was in rabbinical school for like a tour of it, because now it's like a semi-functioning synagogue, but mostly it's a historic site that you can kind of like go and get tours and see the way it used to work. Right. It's absolutely incredible inside, the way it's like painted. It's almost like it really is like being in space and being in the cosmos. There's just like the way when you're sitting at the back of the synagogue and looking up, the ceilings are so high and it's like this blue color with I remember there being like clouds and almost planets drawn. It's really like a far out sort of experience. Yeah, it's really neat. I mean, that's the modern restoration from what I remember of it. It's really cool. So I went there once on a tour, and the only other time I've been there was there was like a Jewish moth-inspired storytelling event with a bunch of Jewish people telling their like favorite stories from summer camp. And a good friend of mine asked me to MC the event, so I got to spend like one night in like summer 2012. I MC'd this like storytelling event in the Eldridge Street Synagogue. So
there you go.
Yeah, me and Ben have been
there
in the same space.
Yeah.
So Rabbi Lowenthal basically explains to Ben that our faith believes you can get another bar mitzvah at age 83, since 70 is your life expectancy. So I want to break.
Is that true? Is there basis for that?
So here's the thing. I did a little bit of research. Right? Okay. I had never heard this idea before, but I decided to do a little bit of research. It is something that's been happening more often, right? And apparently it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Basically, the textual basis is pretty universally agreed upon to be in Psalms 90, verse 10, which basically reads, "The span of our life is 70 years, or given the strength, 80 years. But the best of them are trouble and sorrow. They pass by speedily, and we are in darkness." Bit of a downer line. But basically the idea is like lifespan is expected to be 70. And as we entered the modern era, meaning like I guess the contemporary era, and as healthcare improved and people were living longer, more and more people were living past age 70, and so they wanted to sort of commemorate that, and they wanted to be able to mark that, and so people started looking at age 83 as being like life renewed. So I've seen it sort of like talked about, but I couldn't find the resource for it. There was one Aish HaTorah article I found that didn't connect it to the Psalms text, but actually to a statement in Pirkei Avot 5:21 by a rabbi named Yehuda ben Tema, who basically says that age 70 is seva, when you have a white head of hair, but it's also a homophone of like satiated or satisfied. Hence, there's this occasional translation of like a ripe old age, I guess. Like, whatever, that's not as important. So apparently it's this thing. I don't think it's like agreed upon by rabbis, but it is this scenario. I did some research. Everyone tends to agree that it's no earlier than 20th century. I actually found the earliest example I could find was the tail end of the 20th century in December 1999, when actor Kirk Douglas had a second bar mitzvah at the age of 83. Yeah. So as far as I could tell from like Googling, right, that was the first public example I saw of this idea of 83 is a second bar mitzvah.
So there's precedent.
There is precedence, right? And I imagine, right, like for Dan Slott, he probably saw that and remembered that and was like, oh yeah, sure, we could go and have that. So of course, Rabbi Lowenthal and Mr. Scheckerberg remind Ben that it's been 13 years since he's been the thing, which also kind of cool that it like marks in canon that at that point in time, from 1961 to 2006 in real time, it's only 13 years in Marvel time, which like I wouldn't be surprised if later they're like, no, it's only been 10 years, right? Like, but this idea that he's been thing for 13 years and therefore it's his second life. And then we get this line, Rabbi Lowenthal ran it by some rabbinical scholars who okayed it, which like, is so ridiculous.
Doesn't work like that.
It doesn't work that way. And any rabbinical scholars will know that you don't need special permission to do it. You don't have a bar mitzvah. You are like everything we talked about earlier made this part like I couldn't take it seriously. It was so cringeworthy and so like it's just an aliyah. But then we get this like montage of Ben studying Hebrew, practicing for his Torah and Haftarah portion. It's it's really sweet and really cute.
And then who's on the invitation?
Right, his Aunt Petunia, sweet Aunt Petunia, and I think Uncle Jake is written.
Yeah.
So page 17 and 18 is incredible because we get this double page spread of this large synagogue on the inside. We've got clergy sitting on the bima, which to me felt very reform, possibly conservative, right?
Yeah.
But like that idea of like clergy sitting on the bima. The thing is wearing his yarmulke and his tallis, which like it's so awesome to see visually in the comic as opposed to just on a cover, right? To like see that happening is amazing. And then that's when we hit another moment of like, oh, what is going on? Because the thing gives his speech about his Torah portion from the book of Job.
Which is not a thing.
Right, it's not at all a thing. No, the Torah portion only ever comes from the books of the Torah, which Job's part of the Hebrew Bible, not part of the Torah.
When do we read Book of Job, if ever?
I don't think there's any ritual time, a liturgical time to read the book of Job, right?
From what I understand, only you're supposed to learn it on the 9th of Av. It's like because there's a joy you get from learning Torah.
Great.
You're not supposed to have joy on the 9th of Av.
Right, the only Torah you could really study is like Lamentations, right?
Or
a book
Job.
like Job. Right, there is no time when we ritually read from the book of Job.
It's not a Haftorah. It's not a special reading on a holiday.
I think like we've heard some interviews with Dan Slott where he describes himself as being raised like pretty observant Jewishly. I don't know if that's a self-assessment or if he means he was raised Orthodox, but like it feels like a really weird thing where I imagine he's just taking artistic license and being like, I want to write a story and I'd rather talk about Job here because there's just no time that you would read it and it feels like a really weird thing to get wrong.
Real quick, Brandon, who is Job?
Oh yeah, we should probably talk about that. So Job is basically this guy who's sort of righteous and perfect in every way, and God's sort of like, man, check out how awesome Job is today. His life is great, and he loves me. And basically Satan, who in Judaism isn't like the opponent of God, but it's just like a mischievous angel, more or less, walks by and God's like, hey, Satan, you checked out how awesome Job is? And Satan's like, he only loves you because his life is going awesome. If his life were crap, Job would curse you. And God's like, want to bet? Satan says, yeah, I do. And basically there's a bet. And Satan ruins Job's life, kills all his children, like makes his crops die, all this horrible stuff. And then there's basically a round 2 where God's like, all right, now you have permission to hurt Job, just don't kill him. So he like inflicts Job with like causing him to lose his hair, all this horrible stuff. And Job basically like sits down in the dumps and he won't curse God, but he's just like sitting on the ground in mourning, essentially, sitting in a sackcloth, and his 3 good friends come and they sit down with him, and it's the last good thing they do in the book of Job, because the rest of the book is just a series of highly poetic debates between Job and his 3 friends over why would this possibly have happened. And all the friends are like, God wouldn't do this unless you did something wrong, or your children did something wrong. Clearly you did something wrong, and Job's insistent, like, I did nothing wrong. I don't deserve this. It's the epitome of a story of like, why do bad things happen to good people?
Which is kind of, Ben Grimm.
It's very Ben Grimm.
And his 3 friends, the rest of the Fantastic Four, whatever. It's a little heavy-handed that he's reading about Job, but like you said, I can see why Dan Slott wants to taking our little artistic license. But it's okay because he's still standing up there visually. There's an open Torah scroll with Marvel superheroes sitting in the pews. You got Alicia, his girlfriend, sitting next to Mr. Scheckenberg, who's sitting next to Captain Marvel, who's sitting next to, I think Wonder Man or something. Captain America's there. Spidey is swinging into the synagogue. Of course, the Fantastic Four and She-Hulk are in the front row. I guess they got good seats. So
they showed up early.
Yeah, they showed up early, right. So and then it just kind of cuts right to the poker game.
Right, and we find out that one of the members of the Great Lake Avengers wins all the poker games, and there's like this funny beat, and really the issue just sort of rushes towards the conclusion, which is that Alicia Masters offers sexy time with Thing, and Thing very quickly kicks everybody out of the building, out of the hallway, refuses to do anything. And there's this meta joke at the end where like Ben's closed the door, he's gone off to do whatever with Alicia Masters, and you see the heroes sort of outside being like, wait, really? And Spider-Man goes, is that it? And the narration just says, yup, that's it, which is clearly a comment on the fact that the series had to end so early.
Right. If Fantastic Four 56 had never happened, this is like a 4 out of 5. You know, like,
yeah.
The thing is a bar mitzvah. But in what you said early on about, like, the Fantastic Four being important because it wasn't centered around a Jewish event. In fact, the only ritual thing that really happens is saying the central Jewish prayer around death. That kind of elevated it. And here it's like, okay, Thing has a bar mitzvah. It's kind of a little silly. But because of the imagery alone, again, that if you take yourself out of it, if I'm putting myself into an 11-year-old mindset, like seeing that, I would freak out. Or if I was 13 or 12, I mean, I would say the height of my comic book reading was 12, 13.
Yeah.
You know, those are like, that's, 1993, Death of Superman, like everything was comics for me. If I had seen a superhero getting a bar mitzvah, I mean, that would have been my whole bar mitzvah. Like,
right, like my theme is superheroes. My theme is Fantastic Four right now. Like,
yeah,
obviously.
obviously.
Yeah.
So that I would, so I would say like a 3.5 or a 4 out of 5.
Okay. Yeah, I think
just because of that.
Yeah.
But it's mostly pretty silly. The inaccuracies in it are pretty annoying if you're a knowledgeable Jew, and it's mostly nonsense at the beginning and nonsense at the end, which is kind of like the experience of a lot of the whole bar mitzvah. I mean, I teach middle school. It's like, it's like studying for it. Most kids hate studying for the bar mitzvah. I enjoyed it. But you have the bar mitzvah and then get to the party, which is silliness.
Right. I mean, there's a weird way in which I wonder if this is sort of what it was like. Like, I had non-Jewish friends who came to my bar mitzvah, and I can't imagine what that thing was for someone who's not Jewish, who just shows up to this, like, what is this service? What is going on? Oh, cool, there's a party. And I kind of feel this way in general about the Thing series, because I've never read any of the other issues, and like maybe I should go and read the first 7. I'm kind of curious to see how in line with the rest of the comic this issue is. It feels to me the same way a lot of times that I've read final issues of series that ended earlier than they were supposed to. They're rushing to finish up storylines, they're rushing to tie up loose ends, and so everything happens faster than it would, and therefore it reads poorer than it normally would. And like last issues are often not as good unless they were planned out last issues. Anytime it's a forced upon you last issue, it tends to read worse than others.
Right.
So I'd be very curious how this stacks up with the rest of that series that Dan Slott wrote. You're being a little more generous than I am. I think that, like, I agree, like, the visual is amazing. The fact he had a bar mitzvah is incredible. Rabbi Lowenthal's a pretty two-dimensional, maybe even one-dimensional character. Mr. Scheckerberg is brought back, but doesn't really do anything that new or exciting. I would give it probably a 3, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm thinking it's better than a lot of things. It's definitely like visibly identifiable Jewish content that's pretty exciting. But between the inaccuracies and the fact that, well, it moves Ben's Jewish journey forward, it doesn't really bring believability to any of the surrounding Jewish characters. Like, I would just cap it at a 3.
Join us next time for part 2 of our episode exploring everyone's favorite Jewish superhero, The Thing. We'll be looking at the wedding of Benjamin Grimm and several holiday specials featuring Ben and his other Jewish Marvel friends. See you next time on Funny, They Don't Look Jewish. You can follow us on Twitter at Jewish Comics Pod, on Facebook at facebook.com/Jewish Comics Pod, or you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com.